Good evening. My name is Wolf Brunner. I'm the director of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and I'm very happy to welcome you all. And I just sent over, since this is a co-organized event between the Center for Advanced Genocide Research and the Max Kade Institute, and since Paul Lerner is the director and is kind of giving us the space, I hand over to him that he can introduce our guest for today.
Thank you, Wolf. Yes, I will. We can be kind of casual because it's a small setting and intimately that way. But I do want to welcome you all to the Max Kade Institute. And if you want to get on our mailing list, you can sign in here on the logbook or just look at our website. And I'm just going to say, in fact, I'll pass out a couple of flyers for our next event. You want to send those around. We're going to do something on the refugee crisis at last. So we have a speaker from Germany, Michael Göring, who's the CEO of the Zeitstiftung, and he's going to talk about the German responses, German reactions to the refugee crisis. I have more. Take a few of these. And that's on Thursday at 3 o'clock in Doheny Library, room 233 on campus. As Wolf said, this is a co-production, co-sponsored by the Kade Institute and the Center. So I want to thank everybody at the Center for making this for being so easy to work with and doing so much for this tonight. Incidentally, I actually looked at my notes and saw the one other event I wanted to mention is that a week from tonight, Monday evening, we have Professor Noah Eisenberg from the New School in town. He's a professor of media studies, German, and film, and he's going to be speaking about Casablanca as a refugee film, kind of in the context of exiles. And so he will introduce it, and then there'll be a screening, and then a Q&A and reception. That's at the Goethe Institute on Wilshire, 7 p.m. next Monday evening. Okay, so it's really, I know I said I'd kind of keep this short, but it's just, this event has been a long time in the works, and it's, as some of you know, we've tried to do this for several years now, and there have been stops and starts, and due to no fault of any of us, and it's just really a delight that we're finally doing this. I've been looking forward to hearing this talk and having you here, Atina, for quite some time, so it's a little bit hard to believe that it's happening, but it's a delight. And Atina Grossmann, as many of you know, is a professor of history in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Cooper Union. But I will speak briefly about her work, but I just feel that it's really necessary for me to comment on a personal level, because I go back many years with Atina, to Columbia University in the early 90s, and I want to say that Atina was really at a university and a history department that's not known for its warmth. Atina stood out as one of the rare faculty members who actually was interested in what was on the minds of graduate students and undergraduates as well, even, and created really a community around her of people who were interested in things like gender, social history, modern Germany, of course, Jewish history. So that, Atina, her classes, her office at Columbia, and actually her apartment too, 113th Street, 11th, okay. It's been a few years. That was a real center of kind of intellectual stimulation and communal warmth. And I mean, I still remember conversations going on in that apartment in the early 90s around in the context of the reunification of Germany. And I remember meeting people like Marion Kaplan, Mitchell Ash, Frank Stern, Renata Breidenthal, all these people who were, important people in these fields, meeting them casually over meals in the apartment. So it's really, both personally and kind of professionally, it's really wonderful to be able to have you here and kind of give back after all that. So Atina Grossmann is a distinguished historian of gender, sexuality, and Jewish history. And I'll just mention a few highlights from her really illustrious career. The book that she co-authored in 1984, When Biology Became Destiny, I would say really created the field of German gender history and women's and gender history, really kind of solidified the work that had been done, pulled it together, and became the quintessential reference point for continued work in that field. Her 1995 book, Reforming Sex, The German Movement for Birth Control and Abortion, plumbed the ruptures and continuities in social hygiene, racial science, and the management, sort of the political management of women's bodies from the Weimar Republic through the Nazi years and into the Federal Republic. And her award-winning Jews, Germans, and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany from 2005, focused attention on the entangled histories of the various itinerant populations in the world of DP camps, defeated Germans, and occupying soldiers. In addition, she's the author of many articles on such topics as The New Woman in Weimar Germany, The Rationalization of Sexuality, Rape in the Soviet Occupation Zone, and more recently, The Transnational History of German Jews and German Jewish Migration. She's held numerous prestigious fellowships, having been a visiting fellow at many places, but just to name a couple of highlights, the Davis Center at Princeton, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the American Academy in Berlin. Tonight, she will be speaking on the topic of remapping survival, Jewish refugees, and lost memories in the Soviet Union, Iran, and India. Tina.
Thank you. And yes, I have roamed much further afield since the days that we were sitting together in German history colloquium at Columbia University. And Paul was a star student and has moved on also. So I'm very glad to be here. And it's also, I think, very nice to have a small group so that we can maybe actually be somewhat informal, certainly in the discussion part. And I will try to not go on too long about each photo because I already terrified Paul with the number of photos that I have, all of which I am extremely attached to. This paper is part of an evolving work in progress, and it's been in progress for several years already. And it does indeed keep evolving and in some ways expanding geographically. It's really part of a project that is trying to suggest a different reading of the Second World War and the Holocaust by mapping the Jewish experience of death, survival, and continued and renewed displacement via the geographical margins. That is to say, colonial and semi-colonial regions, the Soviet interior, particularly Central Asia, Iran, and then a little bit, though I am working on this, but will only make a brief appearance tonight, British India, before returning to the wartime and immediate post-war epicenter of the Holocaust, namely in Poland and Germany. So as, of course, we all know, in recent years, or actually by now almost recent decades, studies of the Holocaust have increasingly focused on its aftermath. Certainly questions of memory and memorialization have become ever more central, but also we have paid more attention to the acknowledged irony that it was the cursed, bloody soil of occupied Germany which became a post-war haven for some 250,000 Jews, the so-called DPs, the displaced persons, who constituted the tiny surviving remnant, the Sherit Hapleta, the Sheres Hapletas of East European Jewry, and that was the subject of my previous book. And these people here, who are photographed in 1946 arriving at a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt in Silsheim. Much less attention, although that is now changing and changing fairly rapidly, has been given to another irony, namely who these people actually are and what their wartime experience was. Namely that it was Stalin's Soviet Union which had provided a crucial, if extremely harsh, and quite inadvertent and involuntary refuge. First in the Soviet interior, Siberia, and other remote areas, and then in Central Asia, for what was the majority of that surviving remnant, which is to say that somewhere between 2/3 to 80% of all Polish Jews who survived the Second World War, and that means that there were about 3.3, numbers are very inaccurate in all of this story, but maybe 3.3 million Jews who were residing in pre-war Poland, perhaps 10% survived, maybe 330,000, and of those, probably 80% of those who did survive, survived because they escaped Nazi occupation and ended up, as many survivors have called it, deported to life. And these are these people in Salzheim, and as you can see, they do not in many ways look like our standard image or your student's standard image of survivors, right? There are small children, there are pregnant women, there are babies, there are older people, though probably not as old as they look, and these are the central characters in my story. These are the survivors who have arrived actually via Poland in occupied Germany after having survived in the Soviet Union. So this story is really still essentially lost. That is to say, it has not been adequately, or until recently, hardly at all, addressed in our research. Their story. It has gone missing in the cracks among Jewish, East European, Central European, and Soviet historiographies, where its traces can certainly be found, but it has not made it into in any sustained manner into either the standard national or standard Holocaust narratives. No one field, Jewish history, Polish history, Holocaust history, wanted to own the story, as it were, even as there has been a good deal of research on pieces of the story, for example, on Poles who were deported to the Soviet Union, or on the Soviet wartime experience of evacuation, or even on the Holocaust itself in the occupied Soviet Union. The story has also not been integrated into our own conceptions, I think, of what we mean by Jewish experience during the Holocaust, or how we understand our own definitions of survivor and survival. It remains also, and all you have to do is go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, for example, or even now Polin, the really quite extraordinary new Jewish History Museum in Warsaw, or to a lesser extent, they're better actually, but even Yad Vashem. This is a history that has remained largely unmarked in museum and cinematic representation. This sort of probably the two main sites that we have for public memory and scholarly work. And of course, I cannot resist mentioning in this context that even in the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation, we did a quick search this morning, and out of some 53,000 testimonies, we yielded 829 interviews that specifically mention the Soviet quote-unquote exile. That still means that I have a lot of testimonies to listen to, but it does tell a story. It does tell a story about the genealogy of the concept of the survivor. So this is a unfamiliar story. It's a complicated narrative of flight, forced migration, relief efforts, sheer endurance. It's a story from the margins, but that is in many ways extraordinarily central. And I just will illustrate that. So in other words, what we're doing is we are trying to fill in this blank space. This is a map from the Holocaust Museum that shows us the general contours of the Holocaust, and then there's that whole universe beyond the lines, beyond the front lines in the Soviet Union, and it's blank. And then really I am trying to expand the map, not quite as far, though one could, not quite as far as we see in this map, but certainly into Siberia and down into Central Asia, into Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Iran, and then even into India. So just to give you a sense of the mapping that I'm trying to do and that one could do in many ways. Here again, you can look at the map in this direction as well. The Caspian Sea will become very important in my story. And here you can see again Iran and India. It says the frontier of India, but really this is a much broader map. Okay, so we're talking about essentially several 100,000 Jews, probably when we begin this story, maybe up to 500,000. Mostly they are Polish Jews. They fall into two groups. First of all, Jews from Western Poland who fled the advancing Wehrmacht into those parts of Eastern Poland in the fall of 1939 that had become Soviet after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. These were Jews from Krakow, from Warsaw, from many, many towns in what became Western Poland, who faced wrenching decisions, sometimes split second, sometimes with a bit more time, depending on how the battle lines were shifting, within families about whether people should flee or not, about who should go, who should stay, what made sense, all decisions that were made in panic and uncertainty, without any possibility, no possibility of knowing the full situation, much less any inkling of what would soon transpire under Nazi control. Families made decisions expecting that they would be reunited. More men than women fled, more young people than old people. Acts that would then become dramatically evident, for example, in the demographics of the ghettos and the death camps, where you did find then more women than men and more older people than younger people. Having, under very difficult conditions, and there are many stories, one of which I just listened to in this morning in the Shoah archives, having escaped, these Jews from Western, now German-occupied Poland, then in 1940 faced deportation from the newly Sovietized territories to which they had fled as spies, as suspect foreigners in a land, the Soviet Union, now allied with Germany, deported as forced labor to so-called special camps in what is generally referred to in people's memoirs or in their memories as Siberia. But in fact, Siberia served as a cipher for other parts of the vast Soviet Union, including sites in the Urals, in Kazakhstan, or here in the Autonomous Republic of Komi. I never even had heard of the Autonomous Republic of Komi, near the Arctic Sea, west of the Urals. This is camp number 53. These are photos, by the way, from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They've all been donated mostly by family members, and each photo has a story because the Holocaust Museum does really, really wonderful photo research. So we know that these are Polish Jews, and we know even who some of them are. So, as an example. At the same time, local Jews who had been living in what had been Poland, Eastern Poland, who were just adjusting to the novel Soviet control only established in 1939, merchants, shopkeepers, Zionists, observant Jews, people simply resistant to the new regime, they too were denounced as capitalists, as Zionists, as subversives, and together with their brethren, and sometimes literally their brethren, because people did have plenty of family across these new borders, were also deported. Again, we really do not have accurate figures. There's a lot of dissension, contestation, debate about the figures, but as I said, perhaps as many as altogether as 500,000. So they, together with the refugees from the West, were also subjected to this deportation to life. The stories are extraordinarily similar when you read them, when you listen to them. Arrested, usually in the middle of the night, the early morning hours. These deportees were given a few hours to collect their personal belongings. Often these were people who had already migrated once, before being marched to a waiting train, sometimes described as a cattle car, which carried them in agonizingly slow and completely confusing fits and starts eastward to destinations that they had no idea where they were going under very, very difficult conditions. And so it was by this twist of history, and that's the title of more than one memoir, which intersected in complicated ways with the general mass evacuation of Soviet civilians, including about 1.2 million Soviet Jews, into the interior behind the lines after the German invasion in June 1941, as well as other deportations. This is a land with a long history of forced migration and deportation, including probably up to 1 million plus ethnic Germans. Because of this twist of history, several 100,000 Polish Jews ultimately escaped the exterminatory German onslaught that followed the invasion, precisely those horrors that engulfed the border territories that Timothy Snyder, of course, has publicized as the Bloodlands. And these Jewish deportees who landed in camps, in factories, in mines, in forests, or on collective farms. This is a collective farm, actually a kolkhoz in Kazakhstan. They were forced to work. They endured hunger, disease, exhaustion, mistreatment, sheer shock and bewilderment at their sudden uprooting into completely unfamiliar terrain and circumstances. The trains dropping them off at seemingly random villages or not even little barracks areas were in the middle of forests, usually in freezing temperatures, as it's described, sometimes extremely hot temperatures, depending on the time of year. They were enjoined to build new lives in exile and never expect to leave. Mostly urban, these Polish Jews, and Poles in general, actually, struggled to adapt to demanding, dangerous work in an extreme climate. They learned to fell trees at literally breakneck speed, driven by warnings to work or die. And indeed, an unknown number did perish. But, and this is really key, in contrast to the situation back in Nazi-occupied Poland, these were horrific conditions which did not specifically or exceptionally affect Jews. To one degree or another, all Poles who were subject to deportation, Jewish or not, and in many ways, as the war advanced, all inhabitants of the beleaguered Soviet Union. Families managed to stay together, though some members died. Children were sent to school, babies were born, makeshift barter and bribe systems, sometimes even clandestine aid from a Jewish Red Army officer or an NKVD officer sustained life. This is a photo of Jewish and Polish children going to school, and they did go to school in Irkutsk in Siberia. Or as just a quote from the testimony that I was listening to this morning, they didn't kill us. It wasn't like the Germans, one survivor recalled in his interview. So this forced migration away from the Soviet territories first attacked by the Germans, which became such sites of mass death. Therefore provided, and I keep repeating this fact because it still seems so alien to the dominant narrative, the main chance for East European Jewry's survival. And it was the so-called Asiatics, as they were called when they came back after the war to Poland. In Central Asia, they were actually referred to as Westerners. But these so-called Asiatics who survived this extreme hardship in the Soviet interior and then Central Asia, who would constitute the numerical, if certainly not the most visible or articulate core of the Sherit Hapleta. And yet we still know remarkably little about their everyday life and their encounters with others who were also deported or who were living in Siberia or Central Asia. What we do know, and I have to go through this history very quickly because otherwise one always has to spend a lot of time just sort of setting the scene, and then I never get to my real story. But it's important to understand that in the summer of 41, after the German invasion, with the Soviets in dire need of Allied support, Stalin negotiated a so-called amnesty, the Sikorsky-Maisky Agreement, with the Polish government in exile in London, which provided for two very important developments. On the one hand, for the formation of a Polish army in exile, under a General Anders who was just released from prison in Moscow, specifically for the purpose of setting up this army, was intended to move out of the Soviet Union via Iran and ultimately make it back to Europe to fight for the fatherland and for the release of Polish citizens, Jewish and not, from the special camps. And with this release, which again took place at different times, sometimes people didn't even know about this amnesty until months later. It depended on sort of the whims of the local commanders and the progress of news. There followed another confusing, chaotic migration, but a voluntary one, of so-called free people, a rush south to the Central Asian republics, following rumors of warm climates and abundance of fruit and other foods. And once arrived, here you see a mother and two children. You can see this is arriving in Bukhara in Uzbekistan, and you can see that they're quite emaciated. They were greeted instead by hunger, overcrowding, typhus, dysentery, malaria, all exacerbated by this extraordinary upheaval of the mass evacuations of all Soviet citizens away from the advancing front into particularly Uzbekistan. This was the world that was later stigmatized as, in anti-Semitic terms, as the so-called Tashkent Front, where the Soviet elite, identified by Avram, speculated while the honest Soviet citizens, Ivan, fought on the front. And once arrived, they did indeed find these horrible conditions, but also an amazing variety of wartime improvisations. Universities in exile, theater troops, Red Army recruiters, NKVD agents, local Uzbeks, Muslims who were undergoing their own difficult process of Sovietization, who were quite bewildered by and often resentful and suspicious of the sudden influx of Western Soviet evacuees, both Christian and Jewish, but also often astonishingly generous, given their own poverty and deprivation. And again, there's much more I could say about this, about sort of the ways in which this everyday contact and these close encounters, if you will, between Polish Jews and Soviet citizens and local Uzbeks were mediated in everyday life, particularly by women. There's a very important gender story to be told here, because it was the women who really engaged in negotiations of food, housing, social mores, as they rented rooms in Uzbek homes, while men were more likely to be working the black market or even being drafted into the army. So an everyday life, if you will, begins in Central Asia. And here you see, for example, this is a photo from a children's home, and it says Bukhara Warsaw, not an accident. It's actually run by the Polish government in exile, because in this period from 41 into 43, 42, depends on who you read, all Polish refugees, whether they were Jewish or not, were at least minimally supported by the London-based exile government, which was in turn dependent on its British host and on private donations, especially from North America. This was a very important government in exile. It had an official embassy even in Kubichev, now Samara. It's another problem, of course, that names changed, on the Russian-Kazakh border. And it maintained, the government in exile maintained some 300 welfare offices throughout Central Asia with both Polish and Polish-Jewish employees. And for example, this orphanage, here you see children in Uzbekistan actually doing a radio broadcast designed to be sent back into occupied Poland. I don't know whether it ever got there, but they're singing patriotic songs. Here you see, this is from Bukhara, you see a group of Polish Jews posing, holding up actually Yiddish periodicals. And again, part of the story is that it was possible, very different, of course, than under Nazi occupation, it was actually possible to sustain Jewish culture and even to some degree Jewish religious observance in the Soviet Union, and particularly in the South, in Central Asia. And here too, again, a children's group. The other part of the story, the formation of the Anders Army, meant that thousands and thousands of Jews, often emaciated, half-starved survivors of labor camps, but technically Polish citizens, most of them had succeeded in resisting taking on, did I say Polish? Polish, they'd succeeded in resisting being given Soviet citizenship. They flocked to the Anders Army recruiting stations. Here you can see one of these recruiting stations. Here Anders is inspecting a division in the Volga region and also around Kubichev. And initially, actually, Jews were virtually a majority of potential recruits, up to 60%, but this is part of the difficult history of Polish and Polish-Jewish relations. Generally, they found themselves rejected, subjected to humiliating inspections, tests, insinuations that they were not good fighting material, unreliable Polish patriots, and significantly for what would happen in post-war Poland, a kind of potential fifth column for a later Stalinist takeover of Poland, Jews who had been saved by the Soviet Union. And moreover, the British, powerfully influential in the exile seat in London, were also not exactly eager, as you might imagine, to see large numbers of Polish refugees cross over, as was the plan, the border into Iran and move on towards Palestine for further training, fearing exactly what did in fact happen, that Polish Jewish recruits, once arrived in Palestine, would desert. And of some 4,000 Polish Jews in the Anders Army, about 3,000 in fact did. This was a situation that worried the British, but did not seem to overly concern the Poles, who were just as happy to move on without their Jewish comrades. Actually, probably the most famous deserter was Menachem Begin, who, however, insists that he didn't really desert, but that's a different story. Okay, so Jewish representatives often also accused here they are again, moving out, the Polish authorities of allowing or coercing, for that matter, Jews to be granted Soviet citizenship at a dangerously fast rate, thus making them ineligible for the army and assuring that fewer Jews would ever be able to return to what they assumed would be a liberated Poland. And it's a very sort of poignant indication of how little these Jews in Central Asia knew about what was actually happening in Poland at the time, that they complained to the government in exile in 1942 that this policy represented, quote, an easy way to get rid of a great number of Jews. And this may create extremely great difficulties for these people when hundreds of thousands will want to return to their families after the war, expecting that that would be possible. And they really knew almost nothing about what was happening behind the lines in the other direction. Again, complicated story, not enough time to go through all the details, but basically, finally, in April of 1943, and already worsening before then, relations between the Polish government in exile and the Soviet Union completely broke down after having worsened over time, and this had to do with the controversy over the discovery of the Katyn graves, the graves of these Polish army officers whose death had been blamed on the Nazis, when in fact it was clear even at the time that it was in fact the Soviets. So Stalin had rejected this investigation, and that led to a breakdown of relations. What that meant was that all of the Polish refugees were now on their own in an exotic, unfamiliar, and volatile exile. And in response, Jewish organizations stepped into the breach for the Polish Jews. The Joint, which had been established in World War I as a major international Jewish relief organization, set up an operation headquartered in Tehran. And here you see the army moving out across the border into Iran. And here you see some of the Jewish recruits, these few Jewish recruits, about 4,000. And you'll notice that there is a woman among them. That's because many of the Jewish soldiers actually were medical personnel, nurses and doctors. So the Joint sets up this relief operation where, together with the Jewish Agency from Palestine and various Landsmannschaften, as they called them, local groups of Polish Jews who were living in Palestine, tried to send food and supplies to their suffering relatives in Central Asia. And the JDC first inaugurated this parcel service from Tehran into the Soviet Union starting in August 1942. Not coincidentally, exactly at the time as the Anders Army was moving into Iran, with over 100,000 Polish soldiers and civilians. There were probably about 115,000 Poles in Tehran in this period during World War II. Again, the very limited number of Jews, they crossed the Caspian in 1942. That army included, as I said, about 4,000 Jews, soldiers and their families, medical personnel. Here, 2 nurses already in a Polish hospital in Tehran, and famously, somewhere between 700 and 1,000 Teheran children who had come from an orphanage mostly in Samarkand, and eventually endured a really difficult journey through Uzbekistan to the port city of Krasnovodsk in Turkmenistan on the shore of the Caspian, and then went on by ship to the Persian port of Pahlavi, or in some cases overland from Ashgabat to Mashhad. Here we are in the transit camps in Tehran, well, actually on the outskirts of Tehran, in transit camps run by the Polish army. These children, these children, in a sense, for the first time in their memory, experienced what they called civilization, coming from Central Asia into Iran. They were given their first showers with soap. They were given medical inspections, immunizations by members of the Polish army and also the British army. Many happily remembered a sense of having finally arrived in civilization. It was an entirely different world from the one we had just left, with tanned, well-dressed, smiling people. And each day was an adventure where we began to learn to play again. Here's the There were barracks and tents on the outskirts of Tehran. You see the mountains in the background. Others recorded much more difficult experiences with starving, ill, terrified children left to sleep under tents in the blazing sun or worrying then about the upcoming winter. But they had, in a sense, arrived in a major capital city, Tehran, as they described it, a modern city, a bustling modern metropolis with brightly lit shops, noisy traffic, and crowded streets. And it was this Tehran that in December 1942, a JDC emissary visited, coming from Jerusalem via Baghdad, to organize local JDC relief committee and to investigate how this general relief program for the majority of the Jews who had been left behind could be organized. He was particularly concerned with the conditions in the Jewish children's camp, where they were awaiting transit to Palestine, where they would finally arrive, very long, arduous journey. Here again they are with their madrichim, with their counselors, some of whom had been extra special sent from Palestine to help take care of them. Here they are still actually at the Tehran bus station waiting to leave. And here they are finally, after having gone via Karachi and the Suez Canal and finally moving up through Suez to Atlit, and they finally arrived to a rapturous welcome here on February 18th, 1943. Again, a group of about 700-800 Jewish children arriving in Palestine at the very moment that the ghettos are being liquidated in Poland. They are being these children and the Jewish refugees in general were also being aided not just by the Polish Red Cross, the British Red Cross, the American Red Cross, the local Jewish Persian community, and also by German and Austrian and Central European refugees who had arrived in Tehran already in the 1930s. Among them, actually, my father. This is his residence permit for Tehran from actually already from the mid 1930s.
Reza Shah was the king.
The old Shah.
Reza Shah.
Yes, the old Shah. And so that is another story that I would love to talk about and would be happy to answer many questions about. But I think this story of the Western and Central European refugee Jews in Tehran certainly bears more investigation, because it's a different story than the Polish story. These are mostly bourgeois Jewish refugees in sort of excruciatingly ambivalent positions. They are, whoops, I'm going in the wrong direction. Those are my parents in the desert. This is the beginning, actually. This is in the late 30s. They are sort of these excruciatingly ambivalent positions, stateless, having lost their homes, livelihoods, professions, contact with families left behind, no sense of what future they might face, but nevertheless, as you see here, my mother on her donkey, my mother shopping in the bazaar. This is in Isfahan. Some friends doing their Weimar calisthenics on the road, skiing in the mountains. As you see from these photographs, they are refugees, stateless, but they are also Europeans, oddly privileged, adventurers in exotic, colonial or semi-colonial non-Western societies. And this, I think, is a part of a history that we also need to reconstruct. As one female refugee physician wrote in her unpublished memoir, "We are all uprooted and put down in this utterly alien culture, replete with adventurous spies, foreign agents, and the wildest rumors." And you just mentioned Casablanca, and of course my mother would always say it was a lot like Casablanca. It's important to keep in mind, this I think is sort of the classic photo of the German Jew with his jacket. Why he decided to have himself photographed with a jacket and a tie in the middle of the desert, I have no idea. But I couldn't resist including this photo. The fact remains that not so different than perhaps in Turkey, that these Western European or Central European Jews were able to find refuge and then actually work in the forcibly modernizing Iran of Reza Shah Pahlavi, and then actually after 41 in Iran that was essentially occupied by the British and the Soviets, as engineers, architects, construction managers, teachers, legal advisors, which was what my father did, secretaries, physicians. Wartime conditions then for refugees were relatively luxurious, and their fortunate circumstances only highlighted by the dramatic arrival of the Polish orphans in hideous condition. And interestingly, in such hideous condition that they inspired the American head of the Red Cross for the Middle East, who was hastily summoned to help organize relief, to talk about these haunting shadows, these walking skeletons, to describe them as the worst humanitarian emergency of the war, and even to refer to the situation of the Polish refugees as this awful Holocaust, interestingly. So that then meant that the relief agencies, the Jewish agency, and the Joint realized that the problem was not the several thousand Jewish refugees resident in Iran, but indeed the hundreds of thousands still in Russia. This is the problem. So Tehran, already a center of wartime intrigue, especially after the overthrow of the old Shah in August 1941, became the hub of this relief operation that shipped vital goods for consumption and trading to the Jews trying to make it through the war in the Soviet Union. So Tehran, it turns out, is a key site for the history of World War II and Jewish refugees, not only by the time, already before the time of the famous Tehran Conference. And again, there are many, many stories to be told about this, which I hope you'll ask me about maybe in the discussion period. Iran really was the epicenter of this early Allied confrontation with the ravages of war, and it's fascinating to read the American and British descriptions of what they saw. After these initial attempts by July and November 1943, just prior to the conference in November, December 43, the JDC and the Jewish Agency, with support from the British and the Americans, organized this lifeline, sort of the Jewish Lend-Lease, if you will, through the Persian corridor to support the Jews in Central Asia. The JDC set up the parcel program. It had its own central warehouse, an independent post office in Tehran, and because the Soviets banned any aid to sectarian groups, you couldn't send packages to the Jewish community in Bukhara. Every single package had to be individually addressed. So people from the Under's Army or people with relatives where they knew names would sit in Tehran and sort of arduously, individually address packages which were filled, here, I love this, which were filled with everything from blankets to sugar to tea, soap, matzah, and were then mailed. By 1944, some 10,000 packages a month were making their way on Red Army trucks from Tehran to the Iranian-Soviet border and then onwards into Central Asia. And what you see here, this is quite remarkable. It's a postcard it's simply addressed to the American Joint Distribution Committee, Tehran, Iran, and it arrived. And on the back, it's April 43, and on the back it says in Yiddish, it says, "Thank you for the matzah." It's April 43. Now, I promise you that there was more than matzah in those packages, but that was what they felt safe saying thank you for. So we have actually this really multifaceted operation to support Jewish refugees that was spread throughout the Middle East. It had outposts in Cairo, in Beirut, in Jerusalem, as well as in British India, where other, I promised I was going to mention India, where other European Jews survived, many of them as internees, actually, in camps for enemy aliens, if they came from Axis countries, and others, especially non-alien Polish Jews, as well as, again, the local Jewish community in Bombay, particularly, worked out of a Jewish Relief Association in Bombay, trying to, again, send supplies to Central Asia and also to support Jewish children who had come in with Polish orphans who were being housed in refugee camps and transit camps in India. Another story I'm happy to tell you about more. So, as I need to move on and get to some sorts of conclusions. So these rescue efforts were headquartered in Tehran, with its hundreds of thousands of Poles, briefly, its handful of other Jewish refugees, easy access, relatively, to Soviet Central Asia. Palestine, it's important to say, and there's more to say about this, was one node, but it was certainly not the only one, and not the key site. This was a process that involved negotiations with the Soviet Union, with the semi-sovereign at this point government of Iran, with Great Britain, the US, the Polish government in exile, the American Red Cross, the Polish Red Cross, Jewish groups, including the Joint, the Jewish Agency, the Bund, and many smaller groups throughout particularly the British Empire, from Australia to South Africa, India, and London. All these groups had differing politics, especially about Zionism, about relations to Poles, about the advisability of general aid to the Soviet Union through the Soviet war relief, rather than a specifically Jewish operation. There was a lot of controversy about that. But they shared the increasingly desperate goal of rescuing those Jews who might still be saved, and most of those were struggling to survive in Soviet Central Asia. Oh, actually, this is a little memento of those internment camps in India, which lists the name of the internment camps. It's my father's little memento. But okay, but these are the people who are being addressed, the Polish Jews struggling to survive. And we have, particularly from the Teheran Children, really harrowing testimonies about the terrible conditions that people endured, about the family members that died, about the terrible diseases, people dying like flies. That story comes, that language comes over and over again. Of the 15 people in our family exiled to Russia, 6 remained. Only my brother and I remained. 3 of us died of hunger and disease. These really hundreds of testimonies that we have that were actually taken in Tehran. But what's fascinating is when you look at these photos, which I'm going to just go through relatively quickly, people are posing to tell a very different story. And it's a story of survival and resilience, and a story that essentially is expressed as better to have been deported as a capitalist, an enemy of the people, than to fall into the hands of the Nazis as a Jew. In the end, we were alive. Our exile had saved our lives. Now we felt ourselves supremely lucky to have been deported, because this was death of a different quality. It was not total. It allowed for survivors. It was a fate shared by non-Jews, although refugees were particularly hard hit. But it was devastating, nonetheless. Ultimately made perhaps even more difficult to bear by the later knowledge that these exiles, as they were called, I like to call them refugees, in Bukhara, in Samarkand, in Tashkent, in Alma-Ata, in Fergana, had in fact been the lucky ones. And here you really do sort of see them presenting themselves as the lucky ones. This is the Sparta shoe factory in Bukhara. These are Polish Jews. This is a women's club, Polish, it's actually a Polish Socialist political party, but in the Holocaust Museum, so these are mostly Jewish women. A youth group, again, imagine this type of posed photograph. You could not imagine it in Poland at the same time. They're posed, of course, these photos, but nonetheless. Children were born. Here's this baby. We'll see him again in a minute. He's holding actually a little red flag because the Jews, as ambivalent as they are about Soviet control, they are following very carefully the progress of the Red Army and singing the patriotic songs of the Great Patriotic War, even as they are desperately struggling to survive. Here, a photo, again, of the little boy born in Bukhara, engaging in encounters with the local population. This was a well-known orphanage, children's home that was run by local Uzbeks. Here, posing at a chaykhane in a tea house. Here, going for outings. Again. And also being able to maintain Jewish customs, to have circumcisions, ritual circumcisions, weddings. This is a Bukhara Jewish wedding, photographed by a Polish Jew who was in part invited because he had a Leica. That also an incredible story about this photographer. He later photographed in the DP camps. Here again, you see the local Bukhara Jews celebrating this wedding together with the Polish Jews. And here, even going sightseeing. This is the Ismail Somali Mausoleum in Bukhara. Here, also at the tomb of Tamerlane in Samarkand. Looks like a sightseeing tour. At the same time, that conditions, in fact, are really horrendous. This is a contradiction that one needs to think about and figure out how to resolve. The war ends. This is VE Day, again from the Holocaust Museum, the photo, VE Day in Bukhara. A repatriation agreement organizes the return of Polish citizens to what had become, for Jews, not necessarily for the Poles, a vast graveyard. And somewhere over 200,000 Jews returned, probably 240,000 maybe, until 1949. Most arrived between February and July 46, just as, not coincidentally, post-war anti-Semitic violence reaches a climax with the pogrom in Kielce. Trainloads of Jewish repatriates here arrived back in Lodz, in Radom, in Krakow, in Warsaw. And the very, very few survivors of the ghettos, the camps, hiding, partisan units, turned out to welcome them and gape in a world where among the several 10,000 of 3,300,000 Polish Jews still alive, there were hardly more than 100 Jewish families, which stood intact still. We came to gaze on walking miracles, whole Jewish families, complete with fathers, mothers, and children. There weren't that many whole ones, but, or as other refugees recalled, when the women saw our children, here you see them, they could not believe their eyes. They all said, "You still have children. Ours have all been killed." And it was at these border crossings that the Asiatics first came face to face with the incontrovertible evidence of the Nazi Holocaust, rumors that had been hopefully dismissed as Soviet propaganda. And again, we could talk about the fact that it really was these relatively large trainloads of Jews who returned unexpectedly that produced both a brief efflorescence of Jewish culture in post-war Poland, especially in areas where Germans had been expelled, but that also did serve as a kind of provocation, excuse, for this anti-Semitic violence, because it wasn't just these tiny, tiny remnants of Jews, but literally tens of thousands that came to reclaim property and homes that had been taken over. And that violence then triggered the mass exodus, the Bricha, into the American zone of Germany, where people like myself, historians, picked up the story without, however, examining the experiences they brought with them. And so it's a story that has not been told for the most part. Political factors, ideological, psychological, the pressures of the Cold War, the dominance of a unified narrative that subsumed all Jewish DPs under this rubric of the She'erit Hapleta, and probably the enduring sense among the Asiatics that their story was not worth telling in the face of the catastrophe that had befallen those who had been left behind, have shaped and distorted history and memory. The repatriates who arrived home in Poland became part of an undifferentiated collective, which in many ways was only invented after the war, first in Poland and then in the DP camps. Shocked by the vast graveyard they confronted, they accepted that role as being undifferentiated, especially as they found themselves forced to flee again. And here they are crossing borders yet again, being refugees. This is now going from east to west rather than from west to east. This is the courtyard of the Rothschild Hospital in Vienna, transit point for the refugees from Poland now, the repatriates. Here, the mothers with their babies. I love this photo. You so rarely see the fathers holding the babies. Orphans. Illicit border crossings, climbing onto trucks, crossing borders, entering now into Berlin, a shelter in Berlin, arriving at the DP camps. This is in southern Germany. We know this is a mother and a child and her father. And here in the DP camp Schlachtensee in Berlin, which was composed almost entirely of repatriates from the Soviet Union. These are almost all people who had survived in the Soviet Union. And then the new babies being born. But these children, this is not an age that had survived in the camps. And this, by the way, is the same little boy in Schlachtensee, a few years later in a DP camp. So he had gotten there. So those stories were silent in order to join a desperately needed home among a community of survivors in the DP camps. And the memories that were recorded and that sometimes even people wrote about in the historical commissions or acted on the stages of DP camps were very often not their own stories. Their stories came from strange places, from Siberia, from Uzbekistan, from Tashkent, from Bukhara, Samarkand, Fergana, Frunze, Alma-Ata, not from the death camps or the ghettos. And when people finally ended up getting ready to leave, especially to a Cold War, here they are on the way to Bremerhaven to get on a boat to go to the U.S., especially to a U.S. ever mindful of an escalating Cold War, people lied. People did not tell the truth about where they had been. They backdated, or they didn't backdate, they foredated the date of their children's birth so that people thought they had been born in a DP camp. They thought they were 3 years younger than they were, just in order to be able to enter the U.S. So we have this overarching, undifferentiated story. These are the same people I began with, of the Holocaust, its victims, its survivors, which has really effaced the role of the Soviet Union as the site where, with substantial financial support from American Jewish aid organizations and other support from Zionist groups, the great majority had survived. And so here on the geographic margins, the only truly viable rescue efforts, the map, the only truly viable rescue efforts could still be mounted for large numbers of Jews even without a clear idea of the scale of the catastrophe. So given such a remapped history, the arguments we have about definitions of survivors become even more vexed. If we exclude the Asiatics, the number of actual survivors and their descendants becomes dramatically smaller. We have to think about what that means in terms of commemoration and rituals of memory. At the same time, we count survivors collectively without knowing their individual and family stories. There's a lot of anxiety, even now, about disaggregating this collective, because as the generation with any living memory of the Holocaust inexorably disappears, those committed to preserving memory fear still, and it's interesting, that post-war German and Allied accusations saying that most Jewish DPs in Germany were refugees from communism and not genuine victims of Nazism might be reactivated. And if the majority of survivors had in fact experienced the more normal horrors of war, rather than the particular catastrophe of genocide, then perhaps German guilt is relativized, and the unique nature of Jewish persecution is obscured, so the fear. At the same time, I would suggest one could have a completely opposite conclusion, that understanding how very few direct survivors there really were, and that most of the saved remnant had survived only because they had escaped Nazi control, only underscores the deadly sweep of the final solution, and also might raise some questions about the old debates about totalitarianism. So these are stories that are about sort of extraordinarily complicated encounters simultaneously with Nazism, Stalinism, and the Orient. They shaped, even if inchoately and invisibly, our understanding of persecution and extermination, as well as definitions of survivors. And I think that this is a history that really decenters both Palestine and Europe, even as they remain key sites to which the story returns after the war. It also reasserts the limited but real efficacies of individual and organizational initiative, reframes the range of Allied, especially Soviet and US maneuvering, and centers the Cold War already within the Hot War. So this path from Poland to Siberia, Central Asia, Iran, back to Poland, then to American-occupied Germany, Austria, Italy, from Tehran and Tashkent to Berlin and Bavaria, and then on to the US, Israel, like these maps, parts of the British Commonwealth, as well as to almost all corners of the world, remaps, reconfigures the history of the Holocaust, rendering it transnational and multidirectional in new ways. And I think these trajectories challenge us to understand the Holocaust more deeply, comprehensively, and maybe above all, in a more comparative context. Thank you. Yeah, so if there are any questions about Iran, India, I'm happy to, it's a complicated story. So if you have energy.
You're working a lot today. I dare to tell you, ask you a question. I think you need to sit down because you look tired.
I look tired? Oh no!
You'll be standing all night?
What?
I'm kind of tired from working all day. I thought you'd be tired, so I don't want to.
You can ask me a question.
I think she's glad to answer.
I just, I like this. It's amazing what you're doing for the community. I think the Persian community would appreciate Persian Jewish community. I'm an immigrant from Iran,
Right.
so I mean I relate to your background story a lot, and I think what you're doing is great. I'm sure people will welcome you if you come to like a synagogue.
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah. So I'm just saying, there's a lot of people that are interested in seeing what you have to say. So just wanted to.
Yeah, no, I've actually, thank you. We can, I mean, we've been trying to get that organized for a while, and I would love to do that. I would love to do that and to make those connections. I should say also that this is a history that is becoming, I think, that is of more interest than it has been previously, both to the Persian Jewish community, exiled Persian Jewish community, or in the U.S., in Germany, and wherever people are living, but also to young Iranians who have picked up on this story, some especially dissidents and exiles who are seeing this history as part of a multicultural Iran that existed and was, was extremely important and extremely lively, and that needs to be remembered and really brought out into the open. So I'm actually working with an Iranian exile filmmaker in Berlin, Ayat Najafi, who is trying to, Alexa, maybe you have some good ideas, who's actually trying to make a film about this, the 30s and the 40s in Tehran. And there's an enormous amount of material. There's an enormous amount of material. And I don't, unfortunately, read Farsi, but others do. And luckily for me, the diplomatic correspondence is mostly in French. So that helps.
You said you touched upon Syrian refugees in Western Europe. Are there any parallels that you can draw between the migration from the west to the east and now the migration from the east to the west?
Well, that's a complicated. That's a very complicated story. I mean, one thing that one can say is that refugees are never particularly welcome. They are always a burden. They strain resources. They produce anxieties among local populations that feel overrun. But one of the big differences here, I think, in this story is that actually, even as we've told the story of the response to Jewish persecution as one of indifference and one of ultimate horrific failure, what this piece of the story does give us is a sense of these really desperate and quite brave and not completely ineffective efforts to provide aid. I mean, this was, these joint packages did not save hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews. To the degree that they survived because they were able to trade on the black market, because they somehow managed to survive weeks, months of typhus, of malaria, because they got aid, or because at the last minute parents were able to sort of desperately shove their children into these orphanages where they were fed and then taken out through Iran. But there is a story of aid. There's even a story about the State Department, too late, 1944, with the War Refugee Board, where most of this correspondence that the JDC engages in, it all goes through APO mail. All goes through CO, American Consulate, Cairo, American Consulate, Istanbul. There's a story about the role of American relief agencies and their ability to cooperate with, even with the State Department. And once, of course, these DPs make it out of Poland and arrive in Germany and Austria, there is an UNRWA, there is a military occupation, there is an infrastructure. So it's a very different situation. But what remains the same is that it's miserable to be a refugee and necessary. Yes.
Hi, I wanted to first thank you for coming. This is a really interesting talk. I'm also Persian Jewish.
That's great. I'm so glad you're here.
I actually took Dr. Grimmer's class a couple of years ago. I'm back. I graduated.
Oh, great. Well, I'd love to talk to all of you.
Well, what I was actually interested in, I did some research and I talked to my grandparents who are now 90 and in their late 80s.
Yes.
And they were telling me about living in Iran during the late 30s and early 40s, and I asked them about their experience, and my grandfather, who's now 90, he remembers he was a teenager, and he said, I remember specifically the Battle of Rostov, he said, in Russia, and he said when the Germans came there, the Iranians thought that the Germans are going to win and that they're going to invade and they're going to come to Iran.
That's right.
So he recalled that during that time they left the gates of the city open. He said, and the Persians, the locals, not the Jews, obviously, they were said they were making kebabs, and they told the Jews of the city, they said, when the Germans come, I'm taking your house, I'm coming here, and he said quite literally the gates of the city were open and they were preparing for the Germans to come. And I actually wanted to do more research on this because it was so interesting to me, it's like my heritage, but I felt like there was very little documentation of this. And then when I researched it further, I saw that there was quite a bit of anti-Semitism, despite the fact that, if you talk to many Persian Jews, even the ones that were alive during that time, they say, oh, we had it so good. I guess good is a relative term.
Well, one thing that we do know for sure is that there was extreme anxiety about Reza Shah and his flirtation with the Germans, and there was, and that's why the Soviets and the British moved in and essentially occupied Iran, and then put, the new Shah on the throne sort of as a puppet to make sure that that wouldn't happen, right? That the gates would not open, and there was, of course, tremendous anxiety that Iran is in a very strategic location, and that this might be a way for the Germans to be able to enter into the Soviet Union, and so that's why you get this very heavy Allied military presence in Iran during the war, which we think of. The official occupation is the Soviets in the north and the British in the south, but there's actually a very large American presence as well. And again, long story, but what's fascinating is this sort of confluence of all kinds of tensions and problems where, for example, if you look in the American military and diplomatic records, what one sees is that the Americans are trying to maneuver among all of these different interests. Because on the one hand, they've got the Poles on their back. The Poles who are virulently anti-communist and who want nothing more than for the Americans and the British to understand that the real enemy are the Soviets, and they want them to go from Iran and invade the Soviet Union. The Americans and the British who are trying at the same time to keep the Soviet ally going with Lend-Lease without completely alienating this noble race, as they call them, the Poles. And then they have to worry about the Iranians, who are getting very upset that now there's 20,000 Poles in Iran who are buying up food supplies, practically, almost causing famine, and bringing in disease, the typhus that came across with the Polish refugees. All of this has to be, sort of negotiated at the same time. Plus, there are the tensions between the Polish Jews and the Poles in the refugee camps. And then there's the anxiety about what kind of reaction will this provoke among the Iranians. And you also get very interesting connections between the local Persian Jewish community and the ways in which they're trying to support the Polish Jewish refugees. And actually, I have one funny anecdote I just have to tell you, which is that on the High Holy Days, the sort of wealthy Persian Jews went to the refugee camps because they wanted to bring the children back to their homes for a holiday meal. But these Polish Jewish children were completely scandalized because they drove up to pick them up. These were wealthy Jews. They came in their, so big cars to pick them up, and it was this, how can they be driving? But on the other hand, it was, this was all terribly important. There's one pharmacist. People always talk about one. I don't know his name. one Persian Jewish pharmacist who practically single-handedly, kept many of these children alive. But
two things. I hope I can make it as short as possible. Back when the time you were talking about, it was very common for a mother to give birth to 7 children and only 2 survived because there was malaria.
right.
And the time you're talking about, there was not like a steady government that would take care of these. So Reza Shah, he was a general when the time you're talking about. He wasn't yet the president. After he became the president, he gave freedom, the most important thing, to the women and made it to modern women and took off the scarves after a trip he had to Turkestan. So the most amazing thing he gave the power, he let women to be themselves and free and work like a brother and sister next to their mankind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's great, but I just like Reza Shah, he gets criticized for letting the Germans go through.
He
doesn't get credit for letting people like immigrants, Jews, like Cyrus the Great, that freed the Jews, right?
Right. No, as I said, that was part of why these refugees were able to enter Iran in the first place, because they were welcomed by the old Shah's regime as experts, as engineers, as doctors, as legal. My father was a legal advisor,
but it
for
was
example.
the oil thing too.
And he banned the chador, causing a great clothing crisis, among other things. This was yes, he did, which didn't make him so popular, as you know. Yes.
Yeah, but it's great things for the country.
Yeah.
You showed some photographs of orphanages.
Yes, in Central Asia. Yeah.
Yeah, and it made me think about my grandmother was a refugee in one of those strange autonomous republics, not Komi but Udmurtia.
Yes.
She put my father, who was a small child, into an orphanage so that he would get a hot meal.
Yes.
Obviously, he wasn't an orphan, so maybe
Right.
not everybody's an orphan, but the majority are.
Right.
But these kinds of strategies of survival
Yes.
also survive in these oral histories.
Yes.
And obviously, people are gone. I'm wondering what other records are there? Published letters or?
There are, first of all, more and more memoirs being published, republished, translated, almost every day it seems. I find another one, or it arrives in my in my inbox. Often, the children or even the grandchildren who find diary excerpts or are trying to reconstruct the story. So we have quite a few of those. We have quite a few oral histories that were done, for example, in Australia. Melbourne is like ground zero for these Polish Jewish refugees. I think it's the place where there are more Polish Jewish refugees who were in the Soviet Union than anywhere else in the world. And actually, the Melbourne Jewish Museum has extraordinary oral histories and is getting more and more. We also have the testimonies for the struggle for survival in the orphanages. We have these amazing testimonies of the Teheran children themselves. Some of them are collected in a book by Henrik Greenberg called Children of Zion. That's only a small part. But they actually, and these were really the people from the Sokhnut, from the Jewish Agency in Iran, who interviewed the children. And first of all, just to get information and to get names for the packages, but also, just got the stories from these really, extremely destitute and traumatized and sick children. So we have those records. There are extensive records from the JDC itself. There are records from the Jewish Agency. There are also, of course, Soviet archival records, which I have not worked on because I don't have those skills. But there are people now who have been working For example, in the Kazakhstan has particularly good archival conditions apparently, or at least it did. Uzbekistan less so. So there are scholars, some of my younger colleagues who I've sort of been pushing out to get into this field because they're actually better qualified to do it in terms of language than I am. I was just sort of the obsessed person who said we have to do this. Natalie Belsky, Eliana Adler, two people who are doing really wonderful research who do know the languages. So there's and then actually in one other source I should mention because it's becoming more and more important. Are actually the records of the ITS, the International Tracing Service, who have the intake interviews from the DP camps of the people who are coming into the DP camps in Germany, and that's sometimes where you can really trace where people actually were, as well as trace how people changed their story. So you see what people say when they're first being processed, where they were, and then by the time they're working out the story for American immigration or for Canadian immigration or Australian immigration, it's completely changed, and people have suddenly survived. And I don't mean to be flippant about this at all, and that's why it's so delicate. Yes, that's why it's so hard to talk about. But people say, well, I survived the camp, whether it's Buchenwald or even Auschwitz, but in fact they had been in Bukhara, today, we call that immigration fraud, right? And people get into a lot of trouble. And these were critical survival strategies for people. In order to be able to, to get out of Europe, to get out of that blood-soaked Europe. So now we can start to reconstruct some of those, not just the actual trajectories, but also the trajectories of the stories. But it's very laborious, and really what we need is everybody who has that family history to excavate it and to reconstruct it. And it really does, I think, raise very serious questions about how we understand survivors and what does it mean if survivors are people who escaped extermination and the horrors that they themselves experienced were not that different from the horrors that other people in the war-torn Soviet Union experienced. The difference being that when they came back to total devastation. And that's also why the Polish Jews had a very different attitude towards the Soviets than the Polish exiles, even though the Polish Jews were by no means naive about the horrors of Soviet control, but they also understood that was what had saved them, and that, as they said, they didn't try to kill us because we were Jews. I mean, and to some degree that happened afterwards, but not during the war. Maybe just, I know, if there are any other questions.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Okay.
Sorry, did they want to go back
Yes.
to Germany, or were they forced to go back? It was
No, Poland.
Poland, sorry.
Well, they did not want to go back to Poland, but they did want to get out of the Soviet Union. And one of the interesting historical questions is, why did Stalin let them go? Because he didn't let the Soviet Jews go. And of course, that fits into this narrative of that the Polish Jews were kind of like the fifth column. They were supposed to come back in these trains, with their worldly possessions, most of which they had, by the time they got to the DP camps, they had lost. And supposed to say, well, but really, the Soviets and the Red Army saved us. So they wanted to get out of the Soviet Union, partially because also they didn't know. They thought they might find their families they thought they could reclaim property maybe. The dream of many of them was to go to Palestine. And again, Zionist networks, again, I could go on for too long. Zionist networks were able to survive in Central Asia. Zionist youth movements, for example, Hashomer Hatzair, the guy who ran, the young man, he wasn't much older than his charges, who ran the camp outside of Tehran. His name was David Lautenberg. Later he became David Laor. He was a young Hashomer Hatzair activist and had been able to maintain his networks, and that was part of what helped him organize the orphanage and organize the, getting children out with the Anders Army, which was not easy. And so there were ways in which that experience allowed, really allowed for the survival of certain Jewish traditions, so that when they got back to Poland, it was often the repatriates who were actually in better shape to reorganize, sort of Polish Jewish life than survivors. It was sort of a combination of partisans and repatriates. But all of this sort of was not really articulated at the time, because the most important thing was to have unity. Yeah.
So my question is sort of related. I'm just curious about the relationship between the two groups of survivors. You mentioned that when they got off the train, the few survivors were there to welcome them. Was there tension? Was there a sense of stigma or shame attached?
There was, yeah. I mean, again, these are questions that we really could do a lot more work on. For sure there was shock and, and a sense of, shame, guilt, so this sense of, oh my gosh, we thought we had it bad and it was horrible. And now we realize, right, that, that we were the lucky ones. So there definitely is tension. One of the questions that I would love to pursue, but I haven't, is, for example, the degree to which once people ended up in the DP camps, where we have this marriage and baby boom, which was something that I wrote about in my book on Jewish survivors in post-war Germany, actually how much intermarriage there was between the sort of the so-called direct survivors and the flight survivors. We're still looking for the right language, how to describe each group. So one term that we seem to be using now is flight survivors. So that's an interesting question, that since survivors married other survivors, but how much did they cross in that direction? But there were also DP camps that were almost entirely composed of repatriates from the Soviet Union, simply because there were so many more of them. They came later. Most of the leadership of the post-war liberated Jews in Germany were actually survivors of the camps. The early leadership were actually people who had been liberated from Dachau and from the sub-camps outside of Dachau, mostly Lithuanian Jews, who became the first leadership of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews. I mean, they were there first. And then by the end of 45, you get the Jews pouring in illegally, infiltrees they're called, right? And that's why they end up in the American zone, not in the British zone, because the British won't let them in for obvious reasons, right? And the Americans, for equally, sort of obvious reasons, are willing to let them in, because in a sense it's no sweat off their backs to support the Zionist goal, because It means they're not going to come to the United States, and they can open their doors in a humanitarian way, at least for the moment. So that's why most of these Jews end up in the American sector and zone.
I want to pick up on what Jenna asked, but from the other side. So, for example, you talked about it when they came and they had this different survival, they felt kind of shame or so. But what about the actual direct survivors? For example, in East Germany, the communists coming out of the camps, they had a very different sense of kind of survival, and they developed a distrust to the kind of immigrants who survived, like say, outside of Germany, in Great Britain or somewhere else. So there was a distrust and a different bond what they had. And so I'm wondering, was there something similar there? And the second question is actually more, what I'd like you to do is to talk a little bit about actually how your parents came, because I think that's a...
Okay, right. How many hours do we have? So you're saying, was there distrust on the part of the direct survivors towards the repatriates,
because
towards
they
the
didn't
people?
share the same fate.
They didn't share the same. They didn't share the same fate. Again, I think there was. Yes, there was a sense that they had an easier, sort of an easier fate, but at the same time, the conditions in Poland were so difficult, and there were so, essentially so few survivors at all, that I think, the need for creating a Jewish community or some kind of Jewish collective, at least initially, overrode some of that, especially if it wasn't made too explicit. And so, and indeed, the repatriates brought a certain amount, as I said, of networks that had been maintained, sort of knowledge of Jewish customs that had been maintained, slightly more intact families. If you look at, who's running the orphanage, and outside of Lodz, where Unsere Kinder was filmed, for example, Helena Beck. This was actually the same woman who ran the orphanage in Samarkand. And so I think those tensions did not become explicit except insofar as there was a great deal of concern about, well, what are we going to, how are we going to take care of all these people? We have enough trouble just figuring out what to do with our tiny group of survivors. And now we're getting, many more people. And also the anxiety about, this escalating anti-Semitism, which is everybody, I'm quite sure that I think, every Jew who was massacred in that Kielce pogrom was a repatriate. Yeah. Because, they were living in those shelters. But I don't want to swear to that because there might have been, here and there, but that was who was being attacked, and that because if we think about it, where do all these Jewish survivors come from? They didn't walk out of Treblinka, they didn't walk out of the forests. There were so few direct survivors in Poland. Yeah, but it was a very, you don't get up to 250,000 people. Or 330,000, So, but those are all important questions that I think we need to read a lot more. I mean, one interesting source, by the way, that I have spent a lot of time reading are also this early reportage from American Yiddish writers and journalists who go to Poland right after the war. And report back and write books. First, write articles in Vorwärts or other journals, and they, interestingly, they are very aware of this distinction, and they all comment on it. So that's something I'm actually working my way through right now. My parents. My parents, yes. I love these photos. I have to go back to. By the way, this I had to go to this for a minute because this is something that my father made for himself, a badge, which I think you need a psychoanalyst to kind of interpret this, but he was a prisoner of His Majesty's government, right? So he made himself this badge that says POW 1941 to 1945 with his nickname and a Jewish star. And then on the back, he lists the British prisons and internment camps where he was interned in India, in British India. So again, you have this whole range of camps, right? You have obviously Nazi camps, you have Stalinist camps, and then you have British internment camps. And everywhere Jews are being interned under very different conditions. But this sort of blew me away when I found this.
What was it made out of?
Cloth.
But just explain how
But
your parents
got-
decided to go to Iran.
Okay. Okay. How do I do this very quickly? First of all, they were both from Berlin. They did not know each other. They always said that they never would have met in Berlin because they were in very separate circles. And my father was 11 years older than my mother, and so they came for very different reasons. My father, because he simply needed a place to go. He was a very, very young lawyer. He was a communist, although not a member of the Communist Party. He'd actually tried to emigrate to the Soviet Union already at the end of 1932. I have an incredible photo album, actually, of revolutionary tourism from the Soviet Union. He went with a comrade, Erich Sternberg, a young physician. Sternberg stayed, ended up in the Gulag, survived, but under very difficult conditions. My father sort of looked around and said, "This is very exciting. I really like this. This is great." And then, only people who speak German will understand this, but this became sort of his favorite phrase. Also, when he was working in the bazaar in Tehran, among other things, with an Iranian Muslim partner, says, "Kein Ort für ein Berliner Rechtsanwalt." No place for a Berlin lawyer. And so he went back to Berlin, but obviously needed to very quickly thereafter, because he was exposed, because, as you know, by April 1933, civil servants were losing, had lost their positions, and he needed to go somewhere. He didn't have an American visa. He was not a Zionist at that time. Interestingly, he emerges from his India internment much more Zionist than he had been. But I think because the British were so awful. And he happened to have, this too being Weimar Berlin, he happened to have a girlfriend at the time who was Armenian. And this Armenian girlfriend was from Tehran. And her family was in Tehran. So his Armenian girlfriend said, "Okay, we're going to go visit my family." So, it was just pure that. And then he was in Tehran. And then was able to find all kinds of interesting work, and there's lots of stories about that. My mother's a completely different story. It's very much the story of this sort of Jewish Orientalist tradition in Germany, someone who wanted nothing more in her life than to go to university and become an Orientalist. She already, at a very young age, was fascinated with the Orient, not with Palestine, but with the Orient. There's actually a very famous mosque in Berlin that became sort of a center for the avant-garde. I don't know actually that she went to that mosque, but it was a world with which she was very familiar. She already started studying Farsi. She could no longer go to the university, but she met up. There was a lot of connections between Germany and Persia, still with Persia at the time. Deutsch-Persische Gesellschaft, lots of business connections, but also cultural connections, and a significant number of Persian students in Tehran, so she started hanging out with them, already learned Farsi, and then basically, as she always said, again, these are these things you learn, these geflügelte Worte, these sort of mantras you learn from your parents that who knows how true they are. But she always said that she felt that when it was clear that she would have to, that one needed to flee, she said, it was a tragedy for her family, but for her it was her stroke of luck. And so she kind of secretly started making contact with some other German Jewish refugees who were already in Tehran. She had been forced to work in a family pharmacy, which she hated. She wanted to be studying her Orientalistic, but she couldn't because she was Jewish and she couldn't go to university. And then tried to get, this is also an interesting gender story in terms of refugees. She tried to get a visa to go to Iran, and the Iranians wouldn't give it to her because she was a single European woman. And they thought she was going to be, join the white slave trade. And they did not trust single European women. And she actually managed to convince her mother to go with her to the mission, the Persian mission at that time, and attest to her good character. And then she also had these letters from pharmacists saying, I need an assistant. Of course, the pharmacist was only looking for a wife. And she told her family that she was only going for a visit, even though she knew that she wasn't planning on coming back. And that became a very tragic story also because, the mother who helped her, and who knows whether her mother knew that she wasn't, she probably did know, I suspect. Of course, she never saw that, her mother again. So there's that element. And then she goes to Tehran and meets my father, who then ends up dumping his Armenian girlfriend who saved his life for my mother, but that's okay. They remain friends. In fact, I was in Tehran as a very young person in 1971 and 73, and this Anna Amelian's son had this fabulous house up in Shimran. He was the representative, would you believe it, of Siemens in Tehran in the 70s, and the connection continued. But my mother wanted nothing more than to stay in Tehran. She did not want to leave, and in fact, that's what saved her, because my father was determined. Again, kind of on Fran Berliner Rechtsanwalt. So in 1941, he decided to go to the U.S. And the British in Tehran were giving visas, transit visas. But of course, and he only had the Janus passports. Okay, this is my last story about how strange Tehran was. Tehran, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, I think Tehran is the only place in the world where the German mission did not put J's in German Jewish passports. And the reason that the German Jews in Tehran got J's in their passports was because when the British were ready to occupy Tehran, they, in the summer of 41, they were planning, and they did, in fact, arrest all German nationals, and the men were taken to internment camps actually mostly in Palestine, which the Germans called concentration camps, and the word went out because it's a small community. Everybody knew each other, right? The word went out that the British were going to send out the Iranian gendarmes to make these arrests, and that if the German Jews didn't want to be included in this roundup, they better have a good way of saying that they were not Germans, and because of course these Iranians wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And so these German Jews actually went to the mission and demanded the J's. So by the time he gets to the Indian border, to the British Indian border in what is now Pakistan, in Quetta, he actually does have the J in his passport. For the British in Iran, that meant that he wasn't considered German. But for the British in India, where they were, of course, much more anxious about that fifth column, and that there were German spies, sort of coming in, pretending to be Jews, or maybe there were Jews who were German spies, that didn't help. So he was then immediately arrested and kept until actually well after the war in these various internment camps. But my mother, in the meantime, was happy as a clam, feeling, she was writing lots of letters. I have a wonderful trove of correspondence because he wrote every day. He didn't have anything else to do. He was in an internment camp, feeling very frustrated. And she was out in the desert. She was the first European woman to climb Mount Demavet. She was quite the adventuress. And
why did they throw him in Palestine? They sent him to camps?
No, this is in India.
It's in India.
Oh, no, the Germans, they said, yes, the British sent the Germans to internment camps in Palestine.
But not your father?
No, he ended up in a British internment because he was, yeah. But if he had stayed in Iran, he would have been fine.
Yeah.
But he didn't want to stay in Iran because it was kind of and then he yeah. So these are, but again, without going into the whole family history, the point is, I think, that there is this interesting story about these European refugees who are refugees and they're stateless, but they're still European. And what that, and we have different examples, whether it's in Shanghai or whether it's in Latin America, and it has its particular sort of formation in places like Iran and India. But again, Tehran is, I'm convinced, is at the center of much of this story. Okay.
So I think we need to give you a break.
Yeah. You need a break.
We have a reception here, so.